Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, so you're here because the whole U.S. government and civil rights thing has got you thinking.
It's a big one for sure.
Yeah, and it's so much more than just laws, right? Like, how did those changes even happen? Or not happen in some cases.
It's all about power dynamics.
Right, who's got it, who's trying to get it, who's being left out.
Exactly. It's a constant push and pull, not just within the government itself, but between the government and the people.
Oh, and don't forget the global stage. Like, who knew the Cold War actually helped push civil rights forward?
That's one of the surprises we'll uncover today.
Seriously, get ready for some aha moments as we dig into this.
We'll be exploring all those turning points, the unexpected links, and even how different historians see this whole story.
Buckle up, folks. It's deep dive time. Okay, so first, we got to rewind back to the very beginning. The Founding Fathers, they were pretty set on preventing tyranny.
Right, absolutely. They were obsessed with it.
Hence, the whole system of checks and balances.
Right, splitting power between the legislative branch,
Congress, the lawmakers,
the executive branch,
the president putting those laws into action,
and the judicial branch.
the courts making sure everything's constitutional,
Exactly. 3 branches, each keeping the others in check.
a three-headed monster designed to make sure no one gets too much power. Genius, Rick.
Genius on paper, but when it came to civil rights, that's where the tension really starts.
Oh, I bet. Because this system makes it super hard to change things, even when change is desperately needed.
And nowhere is that more apparent than with the issue of slavery. I mean, think about it. The compromises they made to get the Constitution ratified.
To even get the country started in the first place?
Right. They basically embedded this huge conflict within the very document that was supposed to unify the nation.
Wow. Okay, so conflict baked right in from the beginning.
Absolutely.
And then you've got Congress. They can make laws, they control the money, but getting anything meaningful done on civil rights, that was a whole other battle, like for decades.
Oh, for sure. But there were these huge leaps forward. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, for example.
That was a game changer.
Absolutely. I mean, we're talking a full-on ban on discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, national origin, everything. Public spaces, jobs. It was huge.
And then the Voting Rights Act in 1965. Finally, breaking down those ridiculous barriers keeping Black Americans from voting.
Like literacy tests, poll taxes, all these tools designed to disenfranchise.
Yeah, straight up voter suppression tactics. Huge wins for sure, but then...
Yes. But then you've got things like the filibuster.
Okay, got to break that down for our listeners who maybe aren't familiar with how this Senate procedure actually stalled civil rights progress.
So picture this. Southern senators, totally against civil rights, they could just talk for hours, days even. This tactic, the filibuster, let them delay or block votes on important laws, even if most senators supported it.
So a system meant to protect democracy.
Used to resist change.
It's kind of mind-blowing, isn't it?
Yeah.
And then what happens when you've got laws on the books, but people just refuse to follow them?
That's where the Supreme Court steps in. And no case shows this better than Brown v. Board of Education back in 1954.
The one that said separate but equal schools were BS, basically.
Exactly. It declared segregation in public schools inherently unequal and therefore unconstitutional.
Huge, but I'm guessing it didn't go over smoothly everywhere.
Oh, the backlash, especially in the South, it was intense. Massive resistance, they called it. Some states actually shut down their public schools rather than integrate.
Whoa. They'd rather have no schools than integrated schools.
It really shows that even the highest court in the land can't force societal change without the will to enforce it.
And it wasn't just about schools, right? The Supreme Court tackled other big issues, too.
Absolutely. Loving v. Virginia in 1967, that struck down bans on interracial marriage. Then there's Regents of the University of California v. Bake in 1978, addressing affirmative action.
And that one's still debated like crazy today.
Oh, for sure. Each ruling pushed boundaries, challenged norms, and honestly changed the fabric of American society. But here's the thing. The courts don't have their own army. They need someone to actually make those decisions happen.
And that's where the president, the executive branch, comes in, right?
You got it.
Right.
But it's more than just enforcing laws. It's about setting the tone, leading the nation, and sometimes making bold moves that Congress just can't or won't.
Like Truman desegregating the military in 1948 with that executive order, basically sidestepped Congress and said, done deal.
Bold move, but not every president was so gung-ho on civil rights.
Like Eisenhower. I thought he was pretty hesitant at first.
He was. But then you have Little Rock, Arkansas. The governor there flat out defied the Brown ruling. Eisenhower was forced to send in federal troops to enforce desegregation.
Talk about a showdown. Shows the power of the presidency, but also the heavy responsibility.
Absolutely. And then you have LBJ, Lyndon B. Johnson, who really became the civil rights president.
Push through those landmark laws we talked about?
He did, but even he faced some major pushback. The backlash against LBJ's actions wasn't just disapproval. It fueled this thing called the Southern Strategy. Basically a political shift that's still shaping things today.
Wow, so the ripples from LBJ's actions are still being felt now. Which brings us to something really interesting. Historians don't all agree on how much credit the government actually deserves for all the progress on civil rights.
It's so much more complicated than just good guys and bad guys.
Right. There are actually different schools of thought, each with its own take on the government's role.
Exactly. And those different perspectives are super important to understand.
Okay, so let's hear them. What's the first one?
Well, first you've got the progressive historians. They argue that the government was the driving force behind dismantling racism.
So they're team government.
Basically, yeah. They point to Brown v. Board, the Civil Rights Act, all that, as proof that society wouldn't have changed on its own. The government had to step in.
Okay, so the government's the hero in this version of the story.
Pretty much. But then you have the revisionist historians. They have a completely different take. They emphasize grassroots activism.
The Montgomery bus boycott, the freedom rides.
Exactly. They say these movements forced the government's hand, that the real change came from the people demanding it, not the government willingly giving it up.
So instead of the hero, the government's more like the reluctant follower.
Exactly. Reacting to pressure, not leading the charge.
Okay, so we've got government as the hero and government as the reluctant follower. What other perspectives are out there?
Now things get even more interesting when you bring in the Cold War historians. They argue that the U.S. actually had a very practical reason for promoting civil rights at that time.
Oh, okay. Now I'm really curious. How does the Cold War tie into the fight for equality at home?
Well, think about it. The U.S. is in this ideological battle with the Soviet Union, right? Trying to convince the world that democracy and freedom are the best.
Right, the American way versus communism.
Exactly. But at the same time, the whole world is watching America struggle with segregation and racial violence.
So it's like they're saying, hey, we're the good guys, but then their own actions don't match up.
Exactly. The hypocrisy was undeniable, and you know the Soviets were more than happy to point that out.
Yeah, I bet. Propaganda gold.
So the Cold War historians suggest that this international pressure, this need to basically save face on the world stage, actually pushed the U.S. government to get more serious about civil rights.
Wow, so in a way, they had to clean up their act to win the Cold War, which ended up benefiting the civil rights movement. That's a crazy connection. Okay, what's the last school of thought?
The feminist and intersectional historians, they bring up a super important point. They argue that the government's focus on race, while obviously important, was often way too narrow.
So even while progress was happening on racial equality, other groups were still being left out.
Exactly. They point out that other forms of discrimination, like based on gender, class, sexual orientation, all of that was often ignored.
So it's like even progress can be incomplete. There's always more work to do. And speaking of work to do, I think it's time to connect these historical views to what's happening today.
Definitely. The past isn't just some dusty old thing. It shapes the present and influences the future, right?
Totally. So let's fast forward to the 21st century. We're still dealing with many of the same issues, aren't we? Voting rights, criminal justice reform, economic inequality. It's like we haven't come that far.
Some things don't change easily. Take affirmative action, for instance. We talked about the Bake case earlier, but that debate is far from over.
Yeah, and it's so complicated. On one hand, you want to make things fair for everyone, address historical disadvantages.
Yeah.
But some people say affirmative action is actually discriminating against other groups.
It's a tough one for sure. And then there's voting rights. Huge victory back in the 60s, but it feels like we're fighting that battle all over again.
I know. We've seen the Voting Rights Act weakened, and there's all these new voting restrictions popping up, stricter ID laws, limits on early voting. It feels like we're going backward.
It's a real concern, yeah. Especially because these restrictions seem to disproportionately affect minority voters.
Exactly. And it raises this huge question, right? Where's the balance between states having the right to run their own elections and the federal government making sure everyone has equal access to voting?
That's a big one.
It's a reminder that the fight for civil rights is never really over. It's a constant push and pull. And it's happening in so many areas of our society. What else comes to mind?
Well, criminal justice reform is another big one where the government's role is being debated like crazy. I mean, the U.S. has the highest incarceration rate in the world, and more people are realizing that the system is just full of racial bias.
It's hard to ignore the data on that.
Yeah.
Racial profiling, different sentences for the same crimes.
Mhm.
The system just seems stacked against people of color.
Yeah, and that's what's fueled movements like Black Lives Matter. They've brought so much attention to the need for police reform, ending mass incarceration, just making the system fair for everyone.
And it's cool to connect this back to the historical perspectives we were talking about, like the revisionist historians who emphasize grassroots movements. They'd probably see Black Lives Matter as a continuation of that, wouldn't they?
Totally. And the Cold War historians might point out that America's image on the world stage is taking another hit, with international groups criticizing the U.S. justice system.
It all comes full circle, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The past, the present, they're all connected. We're part of this ongoing story. But before we go too far, can we quickly recap those different schools of thought on the government's role in civil rights?
Absolutely. So we started with the progressive historians who say the government was essential for fighting racism.
Right. Their team government is the hero.
Exactly. Then there are the revisionist historians. They're all about the power of everyday people, those grassroots movements.
They think the government was more like a follower, reacting to pressure.
Right. And then we can't forget the Cold War historians, who point out that civil rights became the strategic issue during the Cold War. The U.S. had to look good on the world stage.
Had to fix things at home to win the bigger fight. And then finally, the feminist and intersectional historians. They remind us that the fight for equality goes way beyond race. It includes gender, class, all sorts of things.
And remember, these perspectives aren't mutually exclusive. They all contribute to a fuller understanding of this really complex history. They give us different ways of seeing how we got to where we are today.
It's not about picking one side, it's about considering them all.
Right?
And using them to figure out our own understanding of these issues. Which brings us to a really important question for our listeners.
I think I know what you're going to ask.
What do you think the government's role should be in protecting and advancing civil rights? Is it a champion of change, a reluctant follower, something in between? And how can these different historical views help us figure out how to deal with the challenges we face today?
Those are the big questions, aren't they? The ones we all need to be thinking about.
Wow, we've really gone deep on this, haven't we?
We have.
From those founding fathers and their whole vision of checks and balances,
Right.
to those huge Supreme Court cases that basically changed America.
Some big moments for sure.
Yeah, and we saw how powerful the president can be.
For better or worse sometimes, right?
And those ongoing struggles with voting rights and criminal justice reform.
It's been quite a journey through history.
It really has. But as we're wrapping up here, I think it's so important to remember that this fight for civil rights, it's not like a one-time thing.
Oh, definitely not. It's not like we finished it back in the 60s and that was it.
Right. It's not a done deal. It's constant,
Absolutely. It's ongoing. It requires everyone to be paying attention, to be involved.
Because those rights we have today, they were hard-won. People fought for them. Protests, court battles, and they didn't give up.
Exactly. It's on us to protect those rights and to keep fighting for more for the next generation and the ones after that.
It's like we're carrying this torch, It's been passed down to us.
That's a great way to put it. We have to keep that flame burning.
And it brings us back to that question we asked earlier. What role do you think the government should play in all of this?
Yeah.
Should it be out there leading the charge for equality? Or should it be more reactive, responding to what the people want? Where's the line between individual freedom and what's good for everyone?
Tough questions. No easy answers.
It's like they say, freedom isn't free, right? It takes work. It takes these hard conversations.
And that's why this topic is so important. It makes us think about power, about justice, about what equality really means in a country like ours.
We've seen in this deep dive that the government's relationship with civil rights has been messy. It's had ups and downs, good times and bad.
Yeah, lots of progress, but also lots of setbacks. And we're still dealing with the effects of discrimination today.
It's everywhere, in our systems, in our laws, in our everyday lives. But even with all that, we can't forget those victories. The activists who fought so hard, the judges who made brave decisions, the presidents who were willing to stand up for what's right.
Those are the things that give us hope, that remind us change is possible, even when it seems impossible.
And as we wrap up, we want to encourage you to keep learning about all of this. Keep having those tough conversations.
Yeah, don't let this be the end. Read more about it, talk about it with your friends and family, and most importantly, figure out what your role is in making things better.
This fight for civil rights, it's not over. We're all part of it.
It's a story that's still being written, and we're all writing the next chapter together.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.